The abandoned lighthouse stood like a solitary sentinel at the edge of the rocky coastline, its towering silhouette framed by the rising mist. The town's whispers about the lighthouse had always been unsettling: sailors' ghosts, strange lights at night, and the curse of the spiral staircase. "It's just a dumb story," Brian said, standing at the crumbling iron gate that marked the lighthouse's entrance. His voice carried an edge of bravado, though his hand gripped the flashlight a little too tightly. "That's what they all say," Maggie replied, her breath visible in the chilly night air. "Until they climb the stairs." "Yeah, and then what?" Brian shot back. Maggie smirked, the moonlight catching her sharp features. "Then they're never the same. Or they disappear entirely," Hannah added quietly, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Her wide eyes darted to the lighthouse's dark windows, which stared back like empty sockets. "Enough with the ghost stories," Alex said, rolling his eyes. "Let's just do this so Brian can stop pretending to be brave." Brian shot him a glare. "Fine. But you're all coming with me. No backing out now." The gate groaned loudly as they pushed it open, the sound carrying across the silent cliffs. Weeds and broken stone littered the path leading up to the lighthouse. The door stood ajar, its wood swollen from years of storms and neglect. As the group stepped inside, the cold hit them like a wave, the air thick and damp. "Creepy," Maggie muttered, shining her flashlight along the walls. Faded, peeling wallpaper clung to the interior, and the faint scent of seawater and decay hung in the air. Hannah hesitated, her gaze locked on the spiral staircase in the center of the room. It twisted upward, disappearing into darkness. "There it is," Brian said, trying to sound casual. But his voice wavered slightly. Maggie stepped forward, running her hand along the rusted banister. "So, who's first?" Nobody moved. "Come on, it's just stairs," Brian said after a moment. He placed one foot on the first step, the metal creaking ominously under his weight. "See? Nothing to it." "Maybe you should count them," Hannah said softly, her voice barely audible. "Why?" Alex asked, frowning. She looked at him, her face pale. "That's what the stories say. Count the steps, or it gets angry." Brian laughed nervously. "Okay, fine. I'll count. 1. He climbed to the second step. 2. The air seemed to shift slightly, growing heavier. 3, Brian said, glancing back at the others. "See? Totally fine." Maggie rolled her eyes and followed, her boots clanging against the metal. Alex and Hannah exchanged uneasy glances before stepping onto the staircase as well. The climb was slow, the group's footsteps echoing through the hollow lighthouse. Each step felt deliberate, the air growing colder the higher they went. 18, Brian muttered, his voice quieter now. "Are you sure about this?" Hannah asked, her hand gripping the railing tightly. "It's just a staircase," Brian snapped, though he didn't sound convinced. 32, Maggie said, her voice echoing oddly. She stopped suddenly, shining her flashlight upward. "What's wrong?" Alex asked. Maggie's flashlight flickered. For a brief moment, they all saw it, a shadow, impossibly large, shifting just out of reach of the light. "Did you see that?" Maggie whispered, her bravado slipping. Before anyone could answer, a low, resonant sound reverberated through the lighthouse. It wasn't quite a voice, but it carried the weight of something ancient and alive. "Keep climbing," Brian said, his face pale. "Brian, maybe we should," Hannah began, but a sudden gust of wind rushed down the staircase, extinguishing all their flashlights at once. The darkness swallowed them whole. The pitch black swallowed everything, the staircase, the walls, even the faint glint of the rusted banister. The only sounds were their shallow breaths and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs outside. "Turn your lights back on," Brian hissed. "I'm trying," Maggie said, fumbling with her flashlight. The switch clicked repeatedly, but no beam emerged. "Mine's not working either," Alex muttered, his voice tight with fear. "Great," Brian snapped. "Just great." Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind curling through a hollow tunnel. But soon, they grew clearer, indistinct voices overlapping, rising and falling like waves. "Do you hear that?" Hannah whispered, clutching the railing with trembling hands. "Stay calm," Brian said, his voice wavering. "It's just the wind." But they all knew it wasn't. Maggie's hand brushed against the cold metal of the banister, her grip tightening as she felt a sharp vibration beneath her palm. "What was that?" she muttered, jerking her hand away. The staircase groaned beneath them, a deep, mournful sound that resonated in their chests. "Something's wrong," Hannah said, her voice quivering. "We shouldn't be here." Brian forced a laugh, though it was hollow. "We're halfway up. Let's just keep going. It's probably just old pipes or something." "Old pipes?" Maggie snapped. "In an abandoned lighthouse? Really? Do you have a better idea?" Brian shot back. The whispers surged again, louder this time. They seemed to come from below, rising up the staircase, climbing with them. "Did anyone else hear their name?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice barely audible. "What?" Brian said. "I swear I just heard someone whisper my name," Alex said, his head snapping back toward the darkness below. "Don't look down," Maggie said sharply. "Why not?" Alex asked, his voice rising. "Because," Maggie said, her own fear barely contained, "it's probably waiting for you to." As if on cue, the whispers shifted. They weren't just words anymore, they were mocking, taunting, mimicking their voices. "Keep climbing," Brian's voice echoed from somewhere above them, though his mouth hadn't moved. "No," Hannah whispered, shaking her head. "We need to go back," Maggie said, taking a step down. But the instant her foot hit the lower step, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The entire staircase shuddered, the banister vibrating violently beneath their hands. Maggie stumbled, clutching the railing as the roar subsided into a low, guttural growl. "I don't think it wants us to go back," she said, her voice shaking. Hannah's breath hitched, her hand reaching out to steady herself. "It's the stairs," she whispered. "They're cursed. Every step connects us more to, whatever this is." Brian glared at her. "We don't even know what this is." "You." Brian's words cut off as the growl reverberated through the staircase again, this time deeper, almost hungry. The whispers shifted to laughter, sharp, echoing giggles that seemed to rise from the darkness below and descend from the unseen heights above. "Keep climbing," Maggie muttered, gripping the railing. "We have to keep moving." Why would we go up? Alex snapped, his voice tight with panic. That's where it's coming from. We can't go back, Maggie shot back, her face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. You saw what happened when I tried. Then what's the plan? Hannah asked, her voice trembling. We just keep going until it gets us. Brian grabbed the railing, his knuckles white. We get to the top. Maybe there's a way out. Maybe the curse ends there. Alex let out a bitter laugh. Or maybe it's worse up there. The group reluctantly climbed higher, their steps slow and deliberate. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more mocking with each step. 46, Brian muttered, counting under his breath. The air grew colder, biting at their skin. Maggie shined her flashlight upward, though its weak beam only illuminated a few feet ahead. The spiral staircase stretched endlessly above them, its rusted steps vanishing into darkness. Brian, she said softly. What? There's something up there. He froze, following her gaze. The beam of her flashlight trembled as it caught the faint outline of a shadow, a tall, humanoid figure standing perfectly still on the steps above. Is it moving? Alex whispered. No, Maggie replied, though her voice was laced with uncertainty. The shadow didn't react, but the whispers surged, louder and more insistent. Come closer, one of them hissed, clear and cold. Brian forced himself to climb the next step, his legs feeling heavier with every movement. Brian, wait, Hannah pleaded. But he pressed on, determined. As he ascended, the shadow remained still, but something about it changed, it grew more solid, more defined. Maggie's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the figure's face became visible. It wasn't a face. Hollow, empty sockets stared back at them, and its mouth stretched wide in a grin that seemed to split its head in two. Go back. Hannah screamed, grabbing Brian's arm. He yanked it free. We can't go back. But the shadow moved. It didn't step forward or lunge, it simply blurred, shifting impossibly fast, reappearing just 2 steps above Brian. Brian, don't. Maggie shouted as he instinctively stepped closer. The shadow's grin widened, and its hollow eyes locked onto him. Suddenly, the staircase shook violently, the metal groaning under their weight. Brian stumbled, his hand slipping from the railing as the vibrations rattled his bones. Brian. Alex reached for him, but the moment their hands touched, Alex screamed and recoiled. What happened? Maggie yelled, grabbing Alex's arm. It burned me, Alex gasped, holding his hand. His palm was red and blistered, as though he'd touched something scalding. Brian staggered back, his eyes wide and unfocused. I saw something, he murmured, his voice distant. What do you mean? Maggie asked, shaking him. Brian blinked, his gaze locking onto hers. It's not just the stairs, he whispered. It's watching us. The whispers grew deafening, the laughter mixing with guttural growls. The shadow blurred again, vanishing into the darkness above. We can't stay here, Maggie said, her voice firm. If we don't move, it's going to come back. Do we even know where we're going? Hannah asked, tears streaming down her face. No, Maggie admitted. But stopping isn't an option. Brian nodded silently, still shaken. Alex hesitated, glancing down into the void below before following. "Keep going," Maggie urged, leading the way. But as they climbed higher, the air grew heavier, and each step felt like wading through thick, freezing water. And from somewhere far above, the shadow whispered, "You'll never make it." The staircase groaned beneath their weight, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, almost suffocating, and the whispers seemed to seep into their minds, repeating fragmented sentences that twisted into their own thoughts. "We shouldn't have come here," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. She clung to the railing, her hands trembling. "It's going to kill us." "Don't say that," Maggie snapped, though her own fear was evident. She reached for Hannah, trying to steady her. "We're going to get through this. We just have to keep moving." "Keep moving?" Alex shouted, his voice rising in panic. "We don't even know if there's a way out. What if we're just climbing straight into its trap?" Brian, who had been silent since his encounter with the shadow, finally spoke. "It already has us. It doesn't matter if we stop or go. We're part of this now." His words sent a chill through the group, more piercing than the icy air. The metal steps creaked as they climbed higher, the darkness around them growing thicker. Maggie shone her flashlight ahead, but the beams seemed to dissolve into the void. 48, Brian muttered under his breath. 49. Hannah looked up sharply. "Stop counting." "What?" Brian asked, confused. "Stop counting the steps," she shouted, her voice shrill. "The more you count, the stronger it gets." Maggie turned to her. "What are you talking about?" Hannah's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I've heard stories about this place. People said the steps feed it. That's how it connects to you. Every step, every number, it's like you're giving it permission to take more." Brian hesitated, his foot hovering over the next step. That's just another stupid legend," he said, though his voice wavered. But before he could take another step, the shadow reappeared. It materialized just ahead of them, its hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. The whispers surged, becoming a low, guttural growl. "Don't move," Maggie whispered, holding her breath. The shadow tilted its head, its elongated grin widening impossibly. Slowly, it raised an arm, its long, jagged fingers pointing directly at Alex. "No," Alex breathed, backing away. "No, no, no." The shadow lunged. It didn't strike him directly, instead, it passed through him, its form rippling like smoke. Alex's scream echoed through the lighthouse as he dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. "Alex!" Maggie shouted, kneeling beside him. It's inside me," Alex gasped, his face contorted in pain. "I can feel it." His body began to flicker, shimmering like the light of a dying bulb. "No," Hannah sobbed. "No, it's taking him. Fight it." Brian shouted, grabbing Alex's shoulders. "Don't let it take you." Alex's eyes locked onto Brian's, his expression filled with a mixture of terror and resignation. "I can't," he whispered. And then, he vanished. The group froze, staring at the empty spot where Alex had been. Maggie's voice broke the silence. "He's gone," she whispered, her hands trembling. Brian clenched his fists, his face pale. "We can't stop. If we stop, it's going to take the rest of us too. But Alex, Hannah began, her voice shaking. There's nothing we can do for him, Brian interrupted. His voice was harsh, but his eyes betrayed his guilt. We either keep going, or we die here. The remaining three pressed on, their footsteps echoing hollowly. The air grew thicker with each step, making it harder to breathe. Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of dread settling over her, as though the walls of the lighthouse were pressing inward, watching. Do you feel that? She asked quietly. Hannah nodded, her eyes darting nervously. It's like it's alive. Brian didn't respond. He was too focused on the stairs ahead, his jaw clenched. As they climbed, the whispers changed again. This time, they weren't indistinct, they were personal. Maggie, one voice hissed, soft and familiar. She froze, her heart pounding. Did you hear that? Hear what? Brian asked, turning back to her. It said my name, Maggie whispered. Before Brian could respond, the staircase shook violently, the metal groaning as though it were about to collapse. The shadow's voice boomed around them, cold and sharp. You can't escape me. And then, the steps beneath their feet began to dissolve. The staircase groaned as the metal steps dissolved into shadow, leaving nothing but an endless void below. Maggie gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles white, as the structure swayed violently. Don't stop! Brian yelled, pulling Hannah forward. The stairs, Hannah cried, but Brian cut her off. Just keep moving. There's no other way. Maggie forced herself forward, each step wobbling under her weight as though it would vanish the moment she lifted her foot. The whispers grew deafening now, each one speaking directly into her mind. You're almost mine. Why climb when you can fall? He's already waiting below. Shut up, she screamed, her voice breaking. The shadow reappeared, this time directly ahead of them, its form blocking the remaining steps. It had grown larger, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. The jagged grin on its face seemed to stretch infinitely, as if it were mocking their struggle. Brian stepped forward, his body trembling. Get out of our way. The shadow tilted its head, its voice sharp and cutting. There is no way out. Only the end. Brian clenched his fists, his breath ragged. If this is the end, he growled, then take me first. Brian, no. Maggie shouted, reaching for him. But before she could grab him, Brian lunged at the shadow. The moment Brian touched the shadow, a deafening scream tore through the air. The entire lighthouse seemed to shudder, the walls cracking and groaning. The shadow enveloped him, its form swirling like smoke, and then it was gone. Brian was gone. Maggie and Hannah stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he had been. Why did he do that? Hannah whispered, tears streaming down her face. To give us a chance, Maggie said, her voice hollow. The staircase groaned again, snapping them out of their shock. The steps behind them began to collapse, falling away into the void. We have to go. Maggie shouted, grabbing Hannah's hand. The two of them ran, the staircase disintegrating rapidly behind them. The shadow's whispers followed, now angry and chaotic, overlapping into a cacophony of rage. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a circular room at the top of the lighthouse, its walls lined with old, rusted windows. There! Maggie cried. That has to be the top. They climbed faster, their lungs burning as the last few steps gave way beneath their feet. With a final leap, they collapsed into the room, the staircase vanishing entirely. The light in the room was dim and unnatural, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. In the center stood an ancient, weathered lantern, its flame flickering weakly. "This is it?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "This is what we climbed for." Maggie stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the lantern. "Maybe this is what it wants. Maybe if we destroy it." "No," a voice interrupted, low and chilling. They turned sharply. Brian stood in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "Brian?" Maggie whispered, stepping back. But it wasn't Brian. The shadow had taken his form, its grin stretching across his face. "There is no escape," it said, stepping closer. Hannah screamed, lunging for the lantern. "If it wants this, then we end it." The shadow's form blurred, rushing toward her. But Maggie threw herself in its path, colliding with the shadow and sending it staggering backward. "Hannah, do it!" Maggie shouted. Hannah grabbed the lantern and hurled it to the ground. The glass shattered, and the flame erupted, engulfing the room in blinding light. The shadow let out an inhuman scream, its form writhing and disintegrating as the light consumed it. When the light faded, Maggie and Hannah were outside, standing at the base of the lighthouse. The structure was gone. The rocky coastline was silent, the sea calm and still. Maggie collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged. "Is it over?" Hannah didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the faint outline of a shadow lingered, just beneath the waves. "It's never over," she whispered. The wind carried a faint, mocking whisper back to them. "One step closer."